Hello and welcome. Today we are going to learn a little bit about Mozart's Twinkle Twinkle, or the French name, Vous Dirai-je Maman. So we've got a lot to talk about today. We're just going to kind of try to get an overview of this piece, gain a little bit of an appreciation for it. Let's dive right in. I'm Dr. Zach. Grab a cup of tea and join me. Here is our theme. This is the one that we all know and love. Very simple, right? All quarter notes, all one-to-one. This would be the closest to what I would call like a first species counterpoint, if anything, but it breaks actually right at the end here where we have this. So this isn't actually first species counterpoint, but it's really close. And the reason I think Mozart did this is because if we don't have that extra E at the end, then it sounds like this, which is kind of bland, maybe kind of like a little hollow sounding, right? Versus, yeah, that's much nicer. That E kind of rings and you hear it blend in to the whole piece, which is nice. Okay, and then here, we definitely aren't in first species counterpoint. Even though that's one-to-one, listen to how this sounds. So we keep coming back to this G. So for all of our purposes, that G just kind of holds through the entire measure, okay? That's really what's happening with the melody, and the G's just kind of holding through the whole time. Now when you have something like this is what's called a compound melody, because we have the one note that we keep coming back to while the other note changes. Okay? And this is not something that you would ever see in first species counterpoint. So we've already kind of gone off the rails if we were trying to really hold on to that idea. All right, and then it continues on, so on and so forth, pretty typical fashion. Not too much interesting in the theme, but it's nice to have just so we can compare like how the variations should sound. So variation 1, here is the element that Mozart added, and it is 16th notes, right? Right hand has a bunch of 16th notes, and that continues in both parts. You see this piece is split up into two parts. There's the repeat signs to help us kind of identify that. So in the second part, we just get 16th notes in the right hand. And that continues all the way pretty much through until the end. The left hand is doing something really simple, just quarter notes. And in fact is exactly the same there as the beginning of the theme until it changes here. So we have a lot of kind of overlap to help us blend the two ideas together. The ideas from the theme and now this new 16th note idea. In variation 2, we get now the 16th notes in the left hand. However, we still have the melody in the right hand. The left hand is the accompaniment. All in 16th notes, more or less throughout the whole variation. And you might say, well, wait, where was the melody in variation 1? The answer is you actually have to look kind of at the second 16th note. So we have there's the C, and then we have a G, and then we have the A here, and then back down to G, and then F, E. Here we have it on the downbeat with the 8th note, and then finishing off. So Mozart kind of hid the melody by placing it on the second 16th note of the measure. But we still see that the note of the melody, the C, is what it occurs most in that measure. Right? So that really helps kind of emphasize the melody there. So then variation 3, we get the same kind of idea. We're going to have a different rhythm in the right hand, which is triplets. So then go to variation 4, same idea. We have the new rhythm, the triplet, now in the left hand, but just doing the accompaniment, right? We're not putting the melody in the left hand yet. Okay, and then if we listen to this bit in variation 4, we had something that sounded really similar in variation 2, right? We had this but it is presented a little bit differently because we see in variation 2, there's like all of these ties that hold the notes across multiple measures, whereas in variation 4, those ties are missing. However, we get a very similar effect. Now, in variation 2, this idea comes from fourth species counterpoint, but again, it's not really fourth species counterpoint because we have some other things going on. However, you get that same kind of, like what's called a suspension. Right? So for a suspension to occur, we have this kind of tension, resolution, tension, resolution. And the note that provides that tension is F, creates this nice beautiful chord here, but then in the next measure, we get this sound resolving here. So that's what's required for a suspension, because it's being suspended from the previous measure, right? We're kind of stretching it across the measures to create that tension. All right, so pretty similar stuff so far. We've had, 16th notes in right hand, then the left hand, then we have a new rhythm, the triplets in the right hand, and then the triplets in the left hand. And we had these suspensions both times that the right hand had the melody in variation 2 and in variation 4. So far it's been really pretty straightforward. Some people might have changed the melody into the left hand, like for example in variation 2 or in variation 4, when we give the left hand the rhythmic activity, I could see people also putting the melody there because that makes a lot of sense. But Mozart instead is choosing to keep the melody in the right hand the whole time and only change one variable, right? Where that rhythm occurs. And then he adds some interest to the melody by including these suspensions that we've been talking about. Then we get to variation 5. Variation 5 now we have a very different feel here. Okay, so it's very kind of almost like popcorn, right? Bouncing back and forth. It's alternating the hands. Especially right here. So this is a new idea, right? We still have the melody in the right hand, but now we have this kind of alternation. And we get this in the next part. Okay, so in music, when we go from, in the case of the piano, one key to the very next key to the very next key, whether it's a white or a black key, we call that chromaticism or chromatic notes, all right? So we are going kind of one key at a time instead of how the piece is written in the theme, like this. Okay, now the first time we see this is actually back in variation 2. So we have this bit here in this measure which goes right, so we get that same kind of idea there. So while yes, we have kind of a completely different rhythm here in the way that the notes are being played with each other, we still get that tie to something that happened before, right? We don't see that chromatic descent, right? Descent because we're going down the keyboard in variation 3 or in variation 4. Yes, you may look at it and say, oh, well, there's accidentals. But if we look, for example, in variation 3, when we get to the actual melody notes, they are the notes they are supposed to be. So this measure right here where it goes G to F sharp, right? We have that accidental, the F sharp, but if we listen to the melody, really it's, there's the F, there's the E, and then D. So we get all the notes that we expect in the melody based on the theme. So don't let the extra accidentals throw you off. They're just there to add some more variety and color. Whereas when we have this kind of chromatic descent in variation 2 and variation 5, this is more of a direct kind of deviation from the theme, where we're emphasizing these other notes. I mean, listen to how this sounds in variation 5. Right, we land on that F sharp, and then in the next bit here, we land on the E flat. So there's a lot more emphasis, right, on these chromatic notes. Okay, now we get to variation 6. This shares a little bit of that kind of short rhythm from variation 5, right? Because we get this. So variation 6 has these shorter notes for the melody, and now we have the 16th notes back in the bass, which is a cool choice by Mozart, because up until this point, it's been, right, rhythm in the right hand, rhythm in the left hand, rhythm in the right hand, rhythm in the left hand. Now we have picked up a rhythm again, and he starts with it in the left hand. Sure, it's something that came before, but since it's come before, he's decided to put it in the other hand first. Also, the way that these 16th notes are played is a little bit different, right? So in variation 2, when we see these 16th notes, right, versus this. Okay, so we have this almost what's called like a trill figure, because a trill is when you go like between two notes really quickly. So it's almost like that's kind of written out in this case, and of course a little bit slower than a real trill would be, but it's got this trill-like quality to it. Well, let's take a look back at variation 1, where we had this. There's kind of that trill figure at the end, right? So Mozart took that idea from the right hand of variation 1, and he stuck it in the left hand of variation 6, and again extended it kind of out. And extended it out. So instead of this just, right, where it happens just for that short bit, he goes, and then finally goes into something else. So he's taking elements from another variation and expanding them, putting them in a different hand. Really cool. Also, up until this point, our melody has been mostly sustained notes. Even in variation 5, where I said like we get some of the shorter notes, we still have these full quarter note lengths, right? And here, all quarter notes are gone. So Mozart has taken a previous idea, these 16th notes in the left hand, and now he's adding another layer by putting a new way of playing the melody in the right hand. Also worth noting is that we have these suspensions, right? So that's one of the main things. If you really take a look at this piece, the suspensions are in a lot of variations and help the whole piece sound like it kind of belongs together. All right, now something really cool happens here in the second part. We have this. Okay, now if I just play the left hand here, we now have the melody in the left hand. So we started with the melody in the right hand, and in the second part we put the melody in the left hand. That's the first time he does this in the whole piece. And he doesn't keep then the melody in the left hand. Once we get back to kind of like the opening idea, right, it goes right back into the right hand. But he allows the left hand that one kind of moment. And he transitions into the left hand so wonderfully, because we have this in the right hand. When the right hand takes off, now we have the melody in the left hand. So he kind of like transitioned by keeping the hands really close together. It obscures which hand has the melody, And then once the left hand takes off, we hear that the melody has actually stayed in the bass rather than traveling up with the right hand. Okay, then variation 7. We get the 16th notes now in the right hand. So this is, like I said, it's backwards from before. Rather than going right, left, now we're going left hand, right hand. However, these 16th notes are also a little bit different because he uses a lot of scale kind of figures and idioms. Okay, so we have this new idea of like a scalar kind of pattern. And then when we get to the end of that here, at the end of the line, we have this. So we get, again, like an alternation of the hands, which we first saw in variation 5, right? It's very similar. Also, if we really wanted to be kind of picky here, remember when I talked about the compound lines, how you can have like one hand but two different voices? This is kind of doing the same thing because we have this, and then this note changes here. This note stays the same. This note stays the same. This note changes. Change. Change. Like that. So we get kind of this compound line in the right hand. And if I play all of those notes together at the same time, it would sound like this. Okay, so that, again, is kind of that same suspension idea, right? We have this nice consonant interval going to this, dissonance, resolution. And it was suspended from the previous measure, right? We can think of that as kind of carrying over. All right, and then the second part, we get a lot more just kind of scale stuff. And then here we get something brand new. That F sharp going up to the G is one of 2 times that happens in the whole piece, okay? So this would be a very common way to kind of decorate this part. But Mozart only uses that in 2 variations in here. So he's very conservative with when he chooses to use certain types of decorations for the melody. And that's good, right? Because if you used that F sharp every time, then it would make the variations sound more like each other. It'd be harder to distinguish them. It wouldn't sound as fresh and interesting when you finally got to it. Like in our case, right, we're in variation 7, and he just now decided to have that little chromatic ascent, now that we're going up, added in. So it's kind of related to the chromatic descents that we've seen before. And in fact, if you look at this one, there is no chromatic descent, right? We just have this kind of alternating thing happening. So he adds the chromatic ascent in a piece, in a variation that doesn't have the same thing in the descent. Okay, let's go to the next one. The next one's really cool, probably my favorite. It's the minor variation. Now, this is a really easy way to make a variation. You just kind of do the same thing, but in a minor key. He very easily could have just been like, right? But he decides to really crank up the emotion and the tension here. I would need to practice a little bit more to get all the notes, but you can really just hear it one hand at a time here. So again, we get that kind of tied over, more similar to fourth species counterpoint gesture that we've seen before. And we have something new in this, which is what's called imitation. Now in music, imitation is just like if you were trying to imitate somebody, you'd want to try and sound like them, right? And either you could sound exactly like them or close enough that people kind of understand who you're trying to imitate. Well, we have something similar here. We have this. Left hand. Then here it breaks. So we can get to the end of the phrase. So Mozart didn't just say, okay, I'm going to do the theme but in a minor key. he adds this layer of imitation, and he has these suspensions that we first see in variation 2. And in fact, they look really quite similar in variation 2 and variation 8, with just a few slight changes. Now, remember we talked about this chromatic descent? Well, here is where Mozart really cranks it up. Right, so we have that. Just gonna go on with the right hand for now. Missed that one note. The right hand just within itself has imitation. And then the left hand. So really that kind of cascading imitation again. We have the chromatic descent in all of the voices that enter here. And it's just like really cool. And then of course we finish off pretty much the same way that we started. And so that brings us to variation 9. Now in variation 9, we get this short kind of sound again, right? Which is similar to our from variation 6. However, what ties variation 9 to variation 8 is, again, this use of suspensions. Now if we look, it's almost exactly the same. Major. Okay, so that similarity really helps tie these two together. And we have those same staccato notes like from variation 6. We also, of course, have these staccato eighth notes in variation 8. So those all kind of like tie together. And we have imitation here. So this first two measures. Okay, now we have the left hand. Right, so the left hand just imitates those opening two measures all the way down. And let's look now in the next part for more imitation. Here, two measures. And finally there we get the landing point. So imitation all throughout this one, right? Really helps connect it to variation 8 because that's the first time we hear imitation in this piece. So now let's go to variation 10. Variation 10, we have this rhythm again that we first saw in variation 7, right? But it is being, again, treated a little bit differently. So instead of doing this exact same kind of suspension thing from variation 7, this is straight up accompaniment. Okay, and a cool technique here is the left hand gets to play the melody above the right hand. And then here, the melody technically switches hands. Here's again that chromatic descent. Okay, so the melody technically switches hands in this one, but since it's all up in the upper keys, it sounds like it's really just kind of one hand playing it. So kind of a cool way to incorporate both hands without just, giving one hand the melody for the whole time. So the same thing happens in the next part where we have and then here, right, that was a little bit of that kind of idea from before. And then it goes just kind of right back into accompaniment. Switches hands. So on and so forth. So that is kind of variation 10. Variation 11 is interesting because we have a tempo marking here. This is the first time that we're actually told to play this slower. Now, when I've heard this piece performed before, the minor variation oftentimes is also performed a little bit slower than the rest of the piece, just to provide like a little bit more variety to this piece and not just have everything be super fast all the time. But this variation, we specifically get adagio, right? And we have these dotted rhythms. And then later on, we have this right? So we have all these grace notes, what we call ornamentations, right? Think about like your Christmas ornaments you're decorating. It's decorating the music. And this is very much trying to characterize like a slow classical movement type of piece. We have these dotted rhythms, we have all these ornaments. Later on, like we have this run here, right? That's very much like a classical kind of gesture. So I think that's what Mozart was trying to show with this one. We also have imitation here, right? So we get right? So that imitation carries on in the left hand, and in the right hand, we have this our suspensions, right? Our suspensions came back. Cool. So that's the gist of this one, is it's supposed to be kind of imitating that slow movement in a classical style. Then we get to variation 12, probably the coolest variation because there's bits and pieces of each. For one, we are in 3/4, which means we now have 3 beats in a measure instead of 2 beats in a measure. That's the first time this happens in the whole piece. So again, Mozart saved something unique for the very last variation, right? We now get a 3/4 time signature instead. So we get this in the melody. Okay, so right away, we have that suspension kind of idea again. Although it's not technically a suspension, because the suspension note here is the G, and we don't have it in the previous measure. But it gets the very similar feeling, right? There you go. We have this in the right hand. So we have an ornamentation here, which we saw a lot of ornaments in variation 11. And then the left hand here has those 16th notes, which we've seen in a lot of different variations, right? Used in various fashions. So where does this one come from, though? Well, the answer is variation 2. Right? But now he's taken that idea and he's expanded it a bit so it can fit the 3/4 and does this. So the first time that the left hand gets 16th notes, now we're hearing that again here in the last variation, but there's still something new, right? There's a new layer to it. So that's pretty cool. And then we get to the second part of this piece where we get this. Right? Remember that trill figure that we had from before in variation 6? Well, now it's come back, but it's in both hands, right? And not only in both hands, but it's extended a little bit. And at the end, as this goes on, we have this. Right? Which kind of is reminiscent of that. It's kind of reminiscent of that. It's a little bit different, but I think that's where that idea comes from. So that is kind of the main ideas of this variation. And really, the variation should kind of end here. But in order for this piece to sound like it's actually finished, like we've reached the end, Mozart decided to write a coda. Now, coda it's almost like an epilogue. It's a little bit of extra music to make the whole thing feel like it's finished. Otherwise, like this variation would just end and then that'd be kind of it, and people wouldn't know like, oh, do I clap now? But by adding this extra little bit of music, it makes the piece feel like it's going to be more complete, or it's coming to an end now. So here, this is where we get kind of a lot of the same stuff. We have our chromatic descent in this one. And then we get scale stuff. which of course we saw in variation 7. So variation 7 has kind of been missing up until this point, but we get it here at the end in the coda. And then at the very end, we get that this kind of hands alternating thing. Right, so that brings back some of the other rhythms that we've seen before and just helps tie kind of this whole piece together. So that's all for stuff on the keyboard. And let's see what kind of conclusions we can draw from looking at all these different variations. All right, so here, let's just recap really quick what happened in the piece. We have our theme, which is essentially one-to-one notes, similar to first species counterpoint. Then in our first variation, we have 16th notes in the right hand, second, 16th notes in the left hand, third, triplets right hand, fourth, triplets left hand, fifth, we have this syncopation with the alternating hands. In sixth, we have 16th notes in the left hand, so now we're switching it up. 7, 16th notes in the right hand. Variation 8 is when we first get our minor key, which makes sense too if you're thinking about kind of the hero's journey of this whole thing, right? Where the kind of max conflict happens. Doesn't happen right in the middle, it happens kind of closer to the end, right? So here we have the max tension kind of following that same trajectory. And then variation 9, we have those staccato quarter notes. And then in variation 10, we have the left hand over the right hand, so that kind of new technique. Variation 11 is our slow movement with dotted rhythms, syncopation. Variation 12, we combine rhythms from all the previous stuff and material from all the previous stuff. So here we have some different elements of the variation. So let's look at this really quick. Left hand accompaniment comes from variation 2 and 6, but kind of originates with variation 1. The suspensions, or as sus for short, there is like a slight suspension in variation 1, but we really hear it for the first time in variation 2 with that kind of fourth species counterpoint-esque stuff. And then this is where like the variations all kind of match each other. Variations 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, and 11 all have some sort of like suspension characteristic to it. So that I think would be kind of the overall arching thing that binds this whole piece together. In variation 12, we also get some of the ornaments, which we saw from variation 11. We get the right hand scales in the coda, which we saw in variation 7. We get the right hand accompaniment from the coda, comes from variation 7 and 10. And then the CD, or chromatic descent, in the first part of variation 10 is also present here in variation 12. So a lot of different elements all brought together for the end. So here's some other stuff, like I tracked where the melody and the accompaniment, which was in like which hand, and then some of these like other kind of characteristics. I also then wanted to look at like the suspensions, since those were so important. The chromatic descent I thought was an interesting kind of commonality between them, so I tracked that as well. And then I also tracked when we had imitation. So you can see suspensions occurred in all but just a few of the variations. See, I have slightly there for the first variation because it's like, if you look at it again on your own, you can see that there's a tie across the bar. That technically is like a suspension there, but it's really not quite as pronounced as when we get it in the second variation. That's when you really hear all of those notes against each other with multiple ties across bars and that sort of thing. So for me, that is more significant to kind of like label that as a defining characteristic of variation 2. And then our chromatic descent is also introduced in variation 2. So we get a couple of things in that one to help make the melody sound interesting. Since now we're on our, so we had our theme, variation 1, we're on our third time hearing this melody, right? So it's nice to have some variation there. And then the chromatic descent kind of is hit or miss, right? We don't really get it in a back-to-back variation. So even then, Mozart's like alternating this kind of tension technique that he's using. And I think one of the most interesting conclusions here is I tracked when we had imitation. So we have imitation introduced in the minor key variation, which was variation 8, right? And variation 8 has both that chromatic descent, it has suspensions, it has imitation, right? Like I said, it really cranked up the tension, really had that kind of like the high point of conflict for this entire piece. And then from then on out, either we have a chromatic descent or we have imitation, but we don't actually have both in a significant fashion in any of the rest of the variations. And I think the reason for this is because if we have that chromatic descent going down one key at a time, and you try to imitate that, that creates a lot of possibilities for clashes. And so it worked really well in the minor key because minor keys can really have like an intense characteristic to them. But when we go back into the major keys, I think it just would have sounded so out of place that we couldn't have both of those at the same time. And then a couple other things I tracked here, like I looked at the broken right hand figure where it goes boo-doo-doo, boo-doo-doo, right? We have that a couple of times in the piece. So we have it in variation 7 and 10. And then we also have the melody switch in 9 and 13, where the melody is switching between the hands. Even though in 13, this is where we have kind of the left hand over the right hand, so it doesn't really sound like we have like a bass melody, for example. Okay, so for some conclusions, Mozart used different types of tension to create interest in this piece, right? He had suspensions, he had chromatic descent, he introduced imitation, right? So he uses all these different things in different ways and never really presents the same thing twice, right? It's either in a new hand or it's maybe being presented in a different order from before. So he used all these techniques very intentionally. He also used style to evoke variety in the piece, right? We have that one adagio section, and we have like the minor variation usually isn't played quite as quickly, right? Just because that's kind of more of a stylistic thing. The variations very much like cared about what came before them, right? So we never really got, like I said, an exact repeat of something. There's always something that was a little bit different from what happened before. He also disguised the melody. We kind of like picked out the melody a couple of times, but mostly like the melody wasn't ever just on the beat the whole time, right? There were suspensions, there was kind of displacing it by a 16th note and having that kind of help create some interest, right? And some variety. And then in variation 12, he combined multiple things. We talked about this where the imitation would create harsh clashes in non-minor keys. So we never saw the chromatic descent and the imitation together in a major key. It was either one or the other. And then in variation 8, that's our most tense, again, that hero's journey kind of point of view. Then we have the frequent suspensions really help keep the whole work together. And when he used suspensions, he didn't just always do it the same way, right? Like I said, there's kind of like a fourth species feeling to some of these, but it's not always. Sometimes it's broken up into that compound line, right? So since the suspensions seem so important in this work, I went ahead and tracked those as well. So here in variation 1, I have all the times that the suspension kind of idea appeared, right? Now I said variation 1, it's technically there, but it's just like so quick and so slight. So we have that single note between bars. And then in variation 2, we get kind of 4-species-esque. Variation 4, again, is 4-species-esque, but I make a note, it's way more free because we don't have all those ties across the bar lines. Variation 5, it's very short and syncopated. Okay, this is the one where we're like alternating the hands. So like the sound of the suspension is much more kind of limited. Like you don't get to hear that really continuous flow to it. Variation 7, it's broken in the right hand figure. We talked about that. Variation 8 is 4-species-esque. Variation 9 is 4-species-esque. And that's really, I think, one of the big bridges between those two variations, both that figure and the imitation. And then in variation 11, we have it in 8th notes, and it sets up the syncopation there, right? This is the one that sounds like a slow movement. And then in variation 10, this was one that I added kind of afterwards when I was looking over the piece again. There's technically a 1-note suspension in the broken right hand figure in variation 10. But again, this is one of those things where it's like, that's so slight that like I went ahead and put it in just in case. I'm not sure if it'd be significant enough though to really like make an impact on the listener. So that's my honorable mention is this one from variation 10. So I hope you enjoyed kind of listening and learning a little bit more about this piece. I encourage you to go listen to an actual recording of it. I didn't use one in my video because I didn't want to have a copyright claim, but I hope you learned something today. I hope you found this interesting. Please remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.